Hello, hello. One, two, two, two. Yeah, it's nice and clean, yeah?
we all seated? More or less, yeah. Hi. Hey, good morning, everybody. In case you didn't know, I'm Peter Lamport. I'm chair of the Sutton Trust and chair of the Education Endowment Foundation. You know what? We're truly honored to be hosting this event. It's a fantastic thing that Andreas and his team does. I had a glimpse through the report very quickly. I'll have a look at it in more detail. But a couple of things struck me. First of all, that we spend 2.5 times as much, $30,000, on tertiary than we do on schools, which is a massive thing. And secondary, and Andreas will say it's not that important, is that we spend, our school size, numbers in schools, is about 30% above the OECD average. So we have much bigger, I mean class size, not school size. Anyway, Andreas, great to have you here. You know, at this stage, can we give Andreas a big hand? Now listen, I'm not going to talk for long. You see, I was told once that an introductory speaker should stand up, speak up, and then shut up. So funnily enough, I was told this just after I had made an introductory speech, but I think it was just a general comment. Either way, it's very good advice, so I'm going to keep on moving here. Now, while I have the opportunity, I'm going to say a few words about the Sutton Trust. Since 1997, when we burst on the scene, we've published over 250 research studies. We believe we've influenced lawmakers, etc., on over 30 occasions. Now, this is what I'm really proud of. We have given over 50,000 young people the opportunity to change their lives. Not that they've all done it, but my experience is if you give people the opportunity, more often than not, they will grab it. So, and by the way, we don't just keep them for a day or two. Our minimum size of program is 1 week, and then we go up to 3 years. The other thing I will just reminisce on is that, you know, people can surprise you if they only get the chance. And I'll talk about just one person. She came from a very, very low-income background. She got on our US program, on the summer school, not summer school, on the US program. She gets into Harvard. Yeah, she comes from a very poor background. She gets into Harvard. 4 years later, she graduates from Harvard. Anyway, we have this thing, an opportunity to go on Today program. She comes on Today program with me, and I'm completely outclassed. I just shut up and let her get on with it. I mean, she's terrific. And just to sort of make the circle, she now works for the Sutton Trust. So it's kind of a nice story. But we have thousands of those cases, so that's just one. Now, when we've been doing all this stuff, we also have put social mobility on the map, as you all know. I mean, not so long ago, if you mentioned social mobility, they would think it was, you know, bus services for the elderly or something like that. Today, as we know, social mobility is part of the national conversation. So it goes without saying that social mobility and education are completely intertwined. I believe, and I'm sure Andreas does as well, that education is really the building block of everything. Which brings me to Andreas. I want to say something about him. But before I do, I want to embarrass him a little bit. Michael Gove called Andreas the most important man in English education. Arnie Duncan called Andreas the most important man in US education. And I'll go even further. when it comes to education, Andreas is the most important man on the planet. It's no exaggeration to say that governments get extremely nervous when they are waiting for Andreas' numbers. Well, let's not wait for those numbers very much longer. Something that Andreas says, which I love, which is, without data, you are just a person with another opinion. So, Andreas, please give us some data. Thank you.
First of all, Sir Peter, thank you for hosting this event. After this pandemic, I think this question of opportunity and social mobility is as relevant as it was never before. And the question of evidence and data, I think, also is crucially important. And you have invested your life in both. And so when we made this the topic of this year's edition of Education at a Glance, opportunity, we thought, this is the only place that actually can host us. And I really want to thank you for your commitment to those topics and also for making this work visible. When we planned the summit, it was actually still very uncertain. Could we do this in person? Would we have to resume to remote? And you have taken the courage and say, well, let's try. We'll make it work. And as you can see, it does. But so thank you very much for this. So the topic is equity. And I think after this pandemic, it's no surprise. We have basically seen dramatic losses in learning time in many countries. But I also want to say, Britain came through this actually quite well. Actually, when you look at the length of school closures, actually in upper secondary education, it was quite limited. In early childhood education, actually, you were very good in keeping child centers open, which is the most crucial part. For older students, remote learning can be an alternative. For primary grade students and early childhood education, it just doesn't work. And it has provided no alternative. So I think it's a good sign of this. Where I'm more worried is primary education. Many countries gave primary education more of a priority than the secondary schools. That's not the case for the UK. But still, the average numbers look very good. So in terms of, keeping schools open is quite a good result. I wanted to show you something that I found really interesting. When you look at, on the vertical axis, the length of school closures, and on the horizontal axis, the quality of education as measured by PISA, you can see that countries almost line up on a line. Some people say, it's all about, the severeness of the pandemic, but if you factor this in, it actually doesn't explain very much. Actually, school closures are not explained by infection rates. School closures are much more explained by the capacity of education systems to be resilient, to have frontline capacity of teachers who are capable to design innovative learning environments, by school leaders who can, square social distancing with, learning, who can give parents confidence that they can actually provide a safe learning environment. And that, for me, was one of the most interesting findings, that it's not the pandemic, but it's a lot more to do with the frontline capacity that exists in education. And learning outcomes, high performing. But what this also tells you, if you look at this, have a second look at the chart, it tells you that the worldwide gap has increased. Education systems that used to do well, that were highly performing on the PISA scale, were able to keep their schools open, and low performing school systems kept their schools closed. So the education systems that performed worse fell further behind, while in education systems that did well, the gap did not increase so much. So we see an increase in inequality within countries. Students from wealthy background, they had access to great alternative opportunities, a very supportive environment at home. Often, schools where teachers had the time and resources to connect with them, and students from disadvantaged backgrounds who may have never learned how to learn on their own, who didn't have access to those resources. So we saw an increase in inequality within countries. And here we see the same picture across countries now. That's why opportunity is really so crucially important in the time today. The risks are very clear. And again, here, I think the UK gets quite positive marks when it comes to the share of young adults without baseline qualifications. It's lower than it is on average across the OECD countries. not by very much, but you can see also countries that used to do really poorly on this. You know, the country where I live, France, for example, and it's now on par, and not, almost even better than the UK. So I think this is something that share of, you know, poorly qualified adults is not high, but it's not declining fast enough. Other countries have made more progress on this. But overall, you know, you look at young people without baseline qualifications, the picture looks quite good. When I look at the consequences, you can see clearly, you know, employment opportunities depend on this. The employment situation, of course, in the UK remains strong. I think that's the overall labor market context. You see that mirrored in education, but you can see a clear gap. You know, people with advanced qualifications, you know, you have over 90% of people in employment. When you look at people without baseline, you talk about two-thirds. So it does make a big difference how well you're educated in terms of the employment. That's the first thing. Earnings is another dimension. You can see there's a significant share of people who earn half than the median income if they don't have poor baseline qualifications. So again, people pay a high price, and the price is increasing every year. Those with advanced qualifications have better and better life chances, and those without, you know, that baseline actually fall further and further behind. That's a global picture. That's simply to do with our economies, the polarization of workplaces and so on. So this is not a UK-specific picture, but what it says is that today we just need to pay a lot more attention to the poorly qualified. And some countries, you saw that before, show us that you can actually address this. You think about a country like Korea that used to do really poorly on this. It's now 2% of people without baseline qualifications. Now everybody gets at least, you know, an entry ticket to the global economy. That's something I think we should think about. So not bad marks overall, but I think a warning signal that this situation hasn't improved very much. One thing that I found really interesting is during the crisis, here I compare just 2019 and 20, and I look at just the increase in unemployment. And you can actually see for you know, people without baseline qualifications in the UK, we have not seen an increase in unemployment, which is an outcome of the system actually, you know, keeping people in employment. There are a lot of subsidies going into sort of keeping jobs going, and that's true for many countries. If I look at the financial crisis, you know, all those numbers went down. The poorly qualified during the financial crisis paid a very steep price. I think in this crisis, governments have managed that better in most cases in sort of keeping those jobs alive. What is more interesting is the tertiary qualifications. Now you can basically see the employment situation on the tertiary sector is not so different for most countries. No? In the financial crisis, those with advanced skills got, you know, better opportunities. Those with poor skills, you know, really were suppressed. And that's not visible in this crisis. And the reason is twofold. First, you know, governments did something about it. I think the problem was earlier recognized, but also during this crisis, we actually needed a lot of people with, you know, vocational qualifications, with baseline qualifications. If you think about, you know, who did the hard work during the pandemic, it was those people. We could, you know, work at home with our laptops and so on, but the people who did the hard work were those people. And that's actually something that very, very different from earlier kind of crisis. So two things, government intervention plus the nature of this. No? So you can actually see a really interesting picture on that front. No? The NEET rate, now those people who are not in education, not in employment, still the UK is an average performer. You can say it's so-so. But when you look at many countries, they have seen sort of an improvement on that. No? And for the UK, sort of things have remained pretty stable. And again, that is a group, you know, if you're not in employment, but you're in education, you prepare for your next job, that's okay. If you're not in employment and not in education, you're not even, you know, preparing your future. No? Those people are very, very hard to get back into the system. So I think, and if you think about, you know, 15% of 18 to 24-year-olds, that's a lot of people, you know. Look at, you know, how many people on the street are in this situation among young people. I think that's something really to worry about. Again, some countries have seen quite good improvement on that. I want to, you know, show you some data about migration, because I think they paint a really interesting picture about the UK. First of all, the UK is one of the few countries where, you know, those not in education and not in employment are not primarily migrants. No? You can see in many countries the yellow bar is much longer than the green, the blue dot. No? For the UK, it's exactly the same. No? those people who are at risk are not primarily migrants. The risk of being, the likelihood to being in that kind of group is as high if you're a migrant as if you're a native. No? If you look, for example, here other countries on the right side, in France, in Austria, no? There you can see it's largely immigrants who are in that kind of risk group. In the UK, and a native is pretty much in the same kind of situation. So I think that tells you something about, immigrants, and I think a quite positive picture. And there are a few countries only in this situation, one must say. I think that's something that few countries that are able to attract the caliber of immigrants than the UK. You can also see, you're also one of the few countries where, migrants are much better represented in a highly educated group than in the poorly educated group. Compare that with the United States. Basically, among tertiary graduates, basically the share of migrants is the same in the US and in the UK. But in the US, you have a lot of poorly qualified migrants. The green bar is very long. It's not the case in the UK. That's a difference from what you sometimes have, portrayed in the public debate. These are all poor people who get a lot of social welfare and cost society a lot of money and so on. It's not borne out by the data, at least not among the population for which we have data. Highly qualified migrants are really the kind of dominant picture. It's not poorly qualified migrants. And that's, again, one of the few countries where this is the case. In most countries, indeed, it tends to be more poorly qualified people entering the country. The employment also of migrants. Sometimes people think, well, these people end up on the streets unemployed. Actually, it's not very different from native born. If you think, you are a migrant who was born here or came early, pretty much the same as a native born. If you are a recently immigrated person, also there, pretty much the same kind of employment prospect as a native born. So actually the labor market is very, very good in extracting value from people of all it doesn't, penalize people from coming from elsewhere. Very different from what you can see in other countries. Now you can compare, UK with France or Estonia or other countries where the red dot is a lot lower. Now you are a newly immigrated person and you actually have much poorer employment prospect. So again, I think that's the strength of the economy, being open to migration, but also I think it shows you that the people who are here serve, a lot in the economic needs. It's not always true for earnings. That's also interesting. When you look at the earnings of tertiary graduates, basically here I show you the earnings of foreign-born workers as a percentage of the earnings of native-born workers. For college, for university graduates, it's the same. Employers basically pay migrants and natives the same. If you are actually below upper secondary education, you don't have, a good kind of baseline qualification, then you can see in the UK actually they pay you very little. They still employ you. So basically the labor market gets a quite a low-cost labor pool for which it pays less, but it still keeps people in employment. So it's actually a benefit for the economy, not necessarily for the people. So there you can see the pay gap is larger, and for people with upper secondary qualifications, then again, it's quite similar to people who are native born. I show you these three slides simply because I do think there's quite a contrast to what, at least in other countries, we hear of the public debate. Migrants are a very valuable resource, a very qualified resource, and a very well-used resource in terms of economic outputs. A few words about gender. We always, pay attention to that. And it's clearly also one variable that affects outcomes in different ways. This might surprise you. In most countries, you can see basically men are the dominant participants in vocational education training. In the UK, it's the reverse. First of all, vocational education isn't particularly attractive to people. For many, it's still a last resort, not a first choice. I think that's where the UK differs from high-performing systems. But also the gender balance is very different. Where does this come from? Well, one explanation is the choice of studies. In most countries, actually, vocational education is about, engineering, is about, construction, is about, professions that are very much science, technology driven. In the UK, you find a lot of people going into the arts and humanities. It's basically the vocational sector absorbs people who are not going to higher education, but provides them with a similar kind of experience. That's a really big difference. And that's something to consider. If you want to make, vocational education really useful to the society, provide the contents where vocational education matters most, where you need people who work on real problems, who work with real people, who work on things that have real consequences, and I think science, technology are really very, very important factors here. And that's basically what I read behind those numbers. And I think that's something to work on. Generally, I think, I know there has been a lot of attention to skills-based education, vocational education, but it's not yet reflected in our numbers. Our numbers still show that, academic education gets more investment than vocational and technical education. Very different from most countries, certainly from the countries that do most. We still see that, young people get a lot of subsidies if they go into universities, and they get very little if they go into alternative routes. And so I think reality is still, in our numbers, not reflecting that policy attention that skill-based education is now getting here. And this is just, another image of this. Now, when I later show you numbers on, university spending, you're going to see, again, that reinforces that kind of disparity. Well, for general education, it's gender balance, and that's true in most kind of systems. Clearly, men are less likely to graduate from tertiary education in most countries, but the UK is closer, sort of, to that. So I think to the average. So that's, I think, something that we have seen happening in most countries. No? More and more, you can see on the school assessments, girls are now doing better than boys in many subjects, and you can see when you look at university studies, you can see that reflected there as well. And, sorry, I showed you that women participation too late. Now you can see the male and the women. So first-time graduates, you can see in most countries, actually, is a big advantage for women. Let me talk a little bit about the gender distribution within the university studies. Here you basically see how it balances across different kinds of studies. And you can see basically the blue dot is where the UK stands. Then I show you in green the country that does best, strongest to gender parity, and then in red the country that does sort of worse. And what you can really see is when it comes to engineering, manufacturing, and construction, you have countries like Iceland that actually are, at least at 40%. In the UK, that's still, predominantly male-dominated. Information and communication technology, the picture is even worse. So you look at this across subjects, and then you go to education, very much female-dominated. So on the rate level, women dominate tertiary education. When you actually drill down and look at where do they study, we still see pretty much the old pattern. It hasn't really changed dramatically. This is something that actually most systems struggle with. It's, by the way, not totally a surprise. In a PISA assessment, we ask 15-year-olds, what do you want to do in your life? And actually, at the age of 15, we see those patterns already mirrored. Girls do quite well in science when we test their skills. That's okay. But when we ask them, do you see science as something that is going to open life opportunities for you? The numbers get much lower. So in one way, you can see the mindset in school is already, framing what we later on see in the study choices people actually make. So it's your most important career decisions you don't make when you graduate from school. You make them in primary school. That's when the world that you see around you, the people that you meet, the teachers that talk to you, that inspire you. I think those things probably are very predictive on this. This is not something that we change, with incentive structures later on. And that's unfortunately where most of the policy attention goes. I think most of the attention goes into, trying to convince people to choose certain university studies, creating incentives for universities to provide certain courses. I'm not convinced, If those things would work, we would have seen improvements, and we don't really see much of a change on this. No. The only exception to this is teachers. No. There you can see basically, in universities, it's still in most countries men, no? In the majority. But if you look at primary education, and pre-primary is above 90% in most countries. Primary education is about 80% women. No? And then in secondary education, it gets a little bit more mixed. No? But you can see really the gender balance is very, very uneven in our education systems. And I don't think the UK stands out in any way. That's a pattern that we observe everywhere. And but I think we need to ask ourselves, why is teaching not attractive for men? And one of the factors is salaries. Now, when I look at the relative earnings of male teachers to similarly educated peers, they are much lower than for men than they are for women, because men earn generally more in certain tertiary studies. In teaching, they're paid the same as women. So you can see the pay gap for men is larger. For women, you can basically say in the UK, you earn as much as a teacher as you would earn as an average worker with a university qualification. For men, that is not the case, and therefore, that's financial attractiveness is one of the factors. But I wouldn't pay too much attention to that alone. People say teachers are not paid very well in the UK. It's not what we see in our data. Actually, salaries are pretty competitive. It's not the financial attractiveness of the teaching profession alone. It's also about career development, intellectual attractiveness, lots of the things around the environment. But clearly, the money is part of the equation that could explain some of the gender gap that you saw before. Last but not least, money. Of course, most things, start and end up with money. And you can see, first of all, that the UK is still one of the highest spending countries. When you look at total investment going in education, it's very, very high. It's one of the few countries that invest more than 6% of the national income on the education of both, this is all levels combined. But you also see that the blue segment is, particularly low. Most of the money really goes into the people who are highly skilled, the university people, and less money goes into the foundations. Here you see that most clearly. Sir Peter, you just mentioned that the spending per student is twice as high at the tertiary level than it's at the lower levels. And that's really something I think worth reconsidering. If you think where education makes a real difference, it is actually in building foundations. Now, where you can justify public money best is really in the early years, in the foundations in school. University education, I think there are lots of opportunities, lots of alternatives that one should consider. And I think why is, and actually this is not just where the education system has ended up. You can see also the trend. If I look at the last, 10 years in the UK, spending on school has more or less stagnated, and spending on higher education is going up and up and up and up. Because that's easy where you can extract money from people. That's sort of easy to finance more and more. And it's also something where you get very popular. University students, of course, are a very dominant voice, but in the foundations, that's something I think you can see very clearly. And you can see also, where the money comes from. Clearly, tuition is now at the top in the UK. And that's not, from the viewpoint of the OECD, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think the kind of income contingent loan system that you have, in combination with means-tested grants, I still think that's a good approach, because it makes sure that, there's a good balance between, the costs and benefits and the sharing of the costs between individuals and society. I still think that's a good system, but, tuition levels, I think it's another question. I think, you need to ask yourself, is the amount that universities charge, adequate? I guess, a lot of people have asked themselves that during the pandemic, can you charge £9,000 for people to consume online content? I think those questions are real. And I think that's sort of one of the factors that drives the kind of cost. I would worry not so much about the way you resource the money, you source the money, namely through tuition and your income contingent loan system. I would worry more about the cost structures now. You can also see that one of the consequences is, you may not worry so much about this, but people from other countries do. You can see actually very few people from low and middle income countries can afford studying in the UK. Now, the numbers are a lot lower than they are, for example, in the United States or New Zealand or Australia, or the Russian Federation, Korea, Japan. And those countries actually make it easier for people for low and middle income countries to study in the country of destination. In the UK, sort of the numbers are pretty low. Now, it's hard for people because of the kind of fee structure. That may be by design, I'm not, but you can see in comparison, other countries make quite other choices. They sort of they give more, emphasis on talent. Like in the United States, for example, if you're really talented, you do get, scholarships even from, from wherever you come from. And I think here the entrance fee is just very, very high. Still, all that being said, the UK continues to be very attractive for international students. Student mobility at every level, bachelor, masters, doctors, is very strong. The UK remains a very, very attractive place for international students, and that has not changed during the pandemic, interestingly. Many countries have seen a dramatic decline, and that's something as in the UK has sort of managed to keep the system attractive to international studies. But basically for the wealthy. And I think, finding a better balance, to attract the most talented rather than the wealthiest, foreign students. And I think there's something to be learned from countries like, US, Japan, Korea, that have made that, more of a deliberate strategy in the last years. I already mentioned you are quite generous in public to private transfers to your loan system. Now, there's still a big chunk of private expenditure going in higher education, but you also have a yellow part that is really about public support. That's very strong in the tertiary sector, so the government has done a lot to actually create the kind of financial support for people. But what's quite interesting, actually, it looks quite different when you go into the early years. Now, this is where the share of private investment is still very high. And subsidies are often linked to employment, so for care of small children, not necessarily for the education component. So, higher education, I see many reasons why you charge people. For the early years, if there's one responsibility for the public sector that really pays off for society, it's early childhood education care. That's, something where, if I look at this, and I have highlighted Japan as worse as the UK, but actually Japan has now, since last year, given full subsidies. So all of those costs are actually borne through private transfers. That's going to change in our numbers in the future. So then from next year on, you'll be number one if this doesn't change. So I think that's an area to consider, how to ensure that all children really have access, not just to first years. And Sir Peter and the Education Endowment Foundation is actually providing you with ample kind of data on this. We have comparative data on this. It hasn't trickled through into public policy decisions. There's still, when you look at, the choices that are being made, how staff are being paid, the group sizes, all of this, we still have a sector that is very heavily tilted to formal education, and where the early years are more about care than about education, and the money is. Spending per student, you can see also there, there's good money going into education on a per student basis. This is counted for a 6 to 15-year-old, so that's basically the kind of foundation education, and you can see the bar is quite long for the UK, not as long as in Norway, in Austria, or Luxembourg, but still, I think it's more a question, how it's evolving, and I alluded to this earlier. You can see for school education, spending in the UK has not changed between 2012 and 18, whereas in most countries, the green bar has gone a lot up. Countries have really massively increased their investment in education. For the UK, that's not the case. Where the UK has put additional money is, again, the college and university sector. That's where we have seen the biggest increase, 20%. That's quite a big chunk of more money going into this, and from a very high level. The twice spending ratio comes from somewhere, and actually part of it was actually reinforced between 2012 and 2018, whereas foundation skills have stagnated a little bit. One of the things that we look at for the first time in this edition of Education at a Glance is how the money actually gets routed to schools. And we've seen a lot of really, really interesting devices that are being deployed. In the past, we had dumb formula system. Basically, we give schools the money per student. That's not very smart, because students have very different challenges. What you can see now is many countries have added components that, look at the social background of schools, that look at or individual students, that look at geographic location, that look at many, many factors that are, contributing to the funding formula. Australia was one of the first countries moving in that direction, but many countries have followed suit, and I think, you have a little bit of that with the kind of pupil premium, but that's just, one slice of it. You have now many kind of very systematic approaches of countries looking into how can we design formulas that give schools and teachers the support they need for each and every student. That's something I think a big challenge for the future. Very last point is simply, again, how money is spent. You can see here, I already talked about teacher pay in relative terms. Here you can see also in absolute terms. Both England and Scotland are quite well positioned. What's different is that in England you get a good starting salary. Now that's above the OECD average, but then there's very little salary progression. So basically advancing in your career makes very little of a difference. So you have that, I was talking about Scotland there. There basically you get well paid at the beginning, and then, you don't get much advances. In England, it's a little bit the reverse. Pay at the beginning is a little bit less, but then you have more room for career progression. I think that latter component is really important, and you can see many high-performing education systems tend to do that. So also here, when people say teacher salaries are low in the UK, not in relative terms. Now, most countries pay teachers in quite similar ways, or even less. So that's, I think, something. But teachers generally are not well paid. You can see in the UK, salaries are similar to average workers. I showed you before the gender difference, particularly for women, not so much for men. But in the UK, actually, that's quite good. When you go to Hungary or the United States or Italy, teachers are really paid a lot less than someone with a similar qualification. But, I would say that's not what I would put the worry. It's not the financial attractiveness. I think it's more about, making teaching intellectually more attractive. Class sizes are large. So Peter, you mentioned that at the beginning. I'm not sure I would put the emphasis there. Many high-performing education systems, when they have to make a choice between, a smaller class and a better teacher, they do invest the money in the quality of teaching. And I would think, that is the right priority. There's a lot of evidence to support it, that class size matters a lot less than investment in the quality of teaching. But, still the numbers are real, and there's a difference between public and private schools. Private schools do have smaller classes, even though, not by such a big margin. But again, I know that's in the public debate a prominent factor. I would attribute, less importance to this, perhaps. This is what I would perhaps worry more about, that British teachers have to devote more of the time to teach. There are fewer hours to do other things than teaching. And if you look, for example, here I have, Japan, for example. I was just doing a briefing this morning with Japanese, and for them it's very important that teachers have sufficient time to care for individual students, that they have time to work with parents, that they have time for lesson study, that they do invest in their profession and their students as individuals. If you're a teacher in Britain, you teach 1 hour after the other, and that scope is more limited. So again, I think that contributes more to the attractiveness of teaching and maybe to the quality of teaching than the size of a class. So this is a factor, I think, to factor into this. And it's not so different by levels of education. Here I just show you sort of the different layers, but for the UK we can't see much of a difference. It's the phenomenon that we see basically everywhere, maybe a little bit less in the early years in primary education. And very last time, this is basically just what it also shows you. I don't have data for England here, but for Scotland, you can see that teachers spend a lot of time. They're very much on the right side, but they also spend a lot of their time doing teaching and have very little time for other things. And I know that England is not that different, but we don't have comparative data. And that's really it. Thank you very much. Look forward to your questions.
Andreas has agreed to take some questions, so I think we can come over here. Do you want to come over here or stay there?
Yeah, I can.
Well, no, you can stay there. Andreas, I think it's my privilege to ask you the first question, if I may. I was listening to your talking about foreign students, overseas students, and the fact that, you know, they're obviously very attracted to the UK. Just our program, we've got nearly 500 low-income British students have gone into the top American universities. We've got 34 to Princeton, 23 to Yale, 21 to Harvard. And they're in all 72 colleges and universities, all private. Now, we know why they can do it. It's because they've all got endowments and they're paying full ride for these kids. Mm-hmm. It's like 300,000. I just wondered what your view on all this was, and, you know, what do you think about it all?
You know, I do think that is so important. You know, the opportunity should be linked to talent, not to, you know, the wealth you're born with. And I think it's a fantastic initiative. Unfortunately, the British university system is not very good at this as a system. As you could see from the data,
sure.
It is more, you know, attractive for people with financial capacities. But I think generally, you know, I think this is the biggest challenge of our times, to ensure that, you know, we align opportunity with talent rather than to create socioeconomic divides. This being said, you know, I must say in the schooling sector, I see sort of gradual progress on this. There's certainly more attention to this. Right. Higher education, I think, probably has a longer way to go on that.
Yeah. Do you want to take two at a time or one at a time? Two at a time?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think Sean is.
Yeah, over there. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Hello, it's Sean Hockin, BBC. In your slideshow, you were showing how the funding for universities and higher education had gone up by quite a lot and school spending had stagnated. What was that money going on in terms of universities? Is that subsidising tuition fees that aren't being repaid? Or is it, where is that going? Because I don't see that going to other stuff. Or was it student numbers increasing? I wonder if you could explain the big boom in university funding.
A little bit of that is numbers. It's increase in student numbers, but a lot of that is increase in the core instructional services. It's not so much research. You know, that in some countries there's been a big increase in investment in the research component. No, but this is largely about core instructional services and a little bit about the increase in numbers. But you have seen many other countries which have seen much steeper increases in student numbers than the UK.
Another question? There you go.
Eleanor Busby from PA News Agency. I just wanted to ask a bit about the highest tuition fees. Obviously, we've seen in the pandemic that lots of lectures have had to go online, and in the autumn term, we're expecting some of the large lectures to remain online. In light of that, do you think that universities can really justify charging $9,250 for, you know, some of the learning which is online?
You know, I think this is a very interesting question. I do think that the value proposition of universities is being challenged in the age in which we live. You know, I don't think you can ask, you know, students to pay £9,000 for just, you know, being online lessons. You know, students go to university to meet great professors. They go to university to work with colleagues or researchers in a laboratory. They go to university to experience social life on campus. Now, that's the value proposition of universities. When that breaks down, I think the alternative of digital only, you know, I think if that remains, I think you're going to see a lot of alternative providers who create, you know, very interesting competition. When it comes to online provision, you know, I don't think universities will retain a monopoly. So I do think that, and that will reflect in the fee structures. Personally, you know, I think this is going to be a real challenge. I think either universities find a good way to do something meaningful that is actually, you know, personal intensive and interactive and social. And then, you know, they can charge for that. Or if they just go digital, you know, I wonder, you know, whether they will be able to maintain those costs. And students are continue to willing to pay for that now.
Yeah.
John Craven from Upreach, thank you for a fascinating presentation. My question is, I think you showed that spending on secondary education in the UK from 2012 to 2018 was flat. Is it true to say that in real terms, per pupil spending has gone down quite a lot?
No, these are basically spending in real terms. So actual, nominally spending has gone up, but you know, you discount for inflation. We always look at this in real terms. So, yeah. No, the bar was about the total spending, but pupil numbers have been constant, so I think you will see the same figures in on a per student basis.
Hello, Cecil Peters from JP Morgan. If our new education secretary came to you and said, we need to reboot the education system, what would you advise? What would you say?
Well, if I look at these data, I think making teaching intellectually more attractive, I think it's going to be a big issue. Now, I think the money is there, but I think in terms of how teachers invest their time, I think that's one of the areas. One area that is harder to sort of capture in quantitative terms, but I would ask myself, harder questions about where the future of work lies and how to align that with the instructional system. I do think, the last years have gone very much into the reproduction of subject matter knowledge, whereas the world rewards people more and more for, can you use your knowledge? Can you apply your knowledge? Can you create new knowledge? And I think social skills. There's a lot, that has gone on in the changes in the skill demands, and the kind of things that are easy to teach have become easy to digitize. And I would, have a harder look at this. I think there's a real risk that education loses its relevance. And the third point, I would, probably look at the balance between how society invests in the early years and how society enables education later in the lives of people, and create a more nuanced funding structure. A funding structure that looks more carefully at the context from which people come from and in which schools operate, rather than, spreading money in a kind of less systematic way. Those are the three areas, that spring out to me from these data.
I think we've got a couple more minutes.
Hello. Yeah, Anders, thanks for a very interesting presentation. I'm interested in not just working hours, but workload intensity. So I'm looking at the TALIS work from last year, the TALIS about the working hours of teachers in England. But I'm also looking at another survey from the British Skills and Employment Survey, which says that it's not just working hours, it's workload intensity. It's about the amount of work you have to do, the deadlines, and the lack of control of the quality processes by which your work is judged. And 85% of teachers in England report that they are exhausted at the end of the working day. That is twice the percentage of all other professions put together, which was, when I read that 2 weeks ago, it's highly shocking. What can we do in England to make teaching more attractive by making it more creative, making it more intellectually attractive? Because the problem we have is one of the reasons why our pay numbers don't look too bad is because 40% of our teachers go within 10 years, which means the opportunities for promotion are better here because the more experienced teachers leave under the no, I don't just think it's at working hours, I think it's work intensity.
Yeah, we have done some really interesting analysis on that question on, teacher perceived kind of workload and stress. And one of the most interesting findings for me was, when you look at the relationship between, workload or perceived workload and teaching hours, pretty flat. Actually, it's not the number of teaching hours that drive, teachers, their workload. When you look at non-teaching but pedagogical working hours, the line gets steeper. I have to mark tests and stuff like this, and I have to sort of, when it goes, and I have to speak with parents and so on. When you look at administrative factors, the line goes up like this. And so in a sense, I think actually and again, making the contrast with countries like Japan, China, Singapore in particular, you'd spend a lot of time as a teacher on other things than teaching, but they all relate to your mission. They all relate to, I understand my students better. My students learn me as a teacher better. I work with the parents. I can get parents on board of I work with my colleagues, to frame new pedagogical practice. And I think that's where I would shift the attention, avoiding, sometimes, the management of mistrust in an education system can become very expensive. We spend a lot of kind of effort into, putting procedures in place that control everything, and teachers have to fill out lots of forms. That's actually, where I would, worry about. But I would not cut the time that teachers spend to know their students. I think, particularly during this pandemic, I think that's been the big differentiator, where teachers were, had a good understanding of how their different students learn differently. They could, reach out to them. And so I think it is more the administrative side that is the issue for teachers, at least in the eyes of teachers. But I must say, all of these are self-perceptions of teachers. We do not have, objective data on workload at the OECD.
Andreas, we've got time for one more question.
Hi, Matt from Oak National Academy. I'm interested in any early insights you have about education recovery and the comparative spending between different jurisdictions and what they might be spending that money on.
Yeah, actually we have, on the spending we have good data. I think the news is positive in that most OECD countries actually increased their spending on education quite significantly during the pandemic. I'm not sure all of that money was used very wisely. It often was just to do more of the same. I think we have seen very little in kind of transformative investments. Basically new pedagogical practice, new technologies, and so on. Most of the spending really went into just hiring more people to deal with the kind of issues. But the money was there. But actually that's what we saw in the financial crisis as well. And then, when the economy recovered, education got a big hit. And so I'm not so sure whether this will be sustained. I think this additional investment, I think it was basically largely emergency spending from stimulus money. And so the resources were there. They went largely into, more of the same kind of spending patterns that we had before, were just reinforced. I am more doubtful about will governments, maintain their commitment to the future. And at least from previous crises, we have seen often education loses the attention of people when things turn to other things.
Hey, Andreas, thank you very much. That was great. You handled the questions, as I thought, brilliantly. I think James Turner here is going to chair a panel now. James is the Chief Executive of the Sutton Trust. He does a great job. So I'm sure he'll do a great job with the panel. And James will introduce the panel. It's a very distinguished panel. So.
Am I supposed to be here? Or?
Yeah, you're okay. On the panel. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Peter, and welcome everybody to the last half an hour of this morning. Welcome to everybody in the room, but also everybody who's watching on the live stream as well. So for this last half hour, we have a panel to reflect on some of the implications for this for the UK system. And so Andreas is very kindly going to stick with us for the panel session, but I'm also delighted to be joined by three other great speakers. So we have Natalie Pereira, who's the Chief Executive of the Education Policy Institute, and EPI have done some brilliant work, particularly over the last year, on the impacts of COVID in schools. So great that you're with us. We also have Lucy Heller, who's the Chief Executive of ARC. And ARC are one of the highest performing academy chains for disadvantaged young people. And then finally, right at the end, we've got David Hughes, the Chief Executive of the Association for Colleges. So really important that voice of the colleges, which is such an important part in the social mobility chain, is heard. So I'm going to ask our panelists to speak for 4 or 5 minutes or so on their reflections on what Andreas has said so far. And then we'll have time maybe for 10 minutes or so of questions from all of you at the end. Natalie, maybe I could pass over to you to kick off, if that's okay.
Great, thank you. And thank you to Andreas and colleagues for having me on the panel. It's wonderful to be back in person in Westminster. So the report that we've seen today covers data up to 2020. So it doesn't even really begin to touch on the impact of the pandemic. And what it underlines to me is that our ambition cannot be just to return to pre-pandemic levels of attainment and equality. And every year, Andreas, we look at this wealth of great data that you and colleagues provide, but we continue, for the UK at least, to see the same trends each year. We see the same thing. A long trail of underperformance in the UK, a considerable socio-economic gap and regional inequalities, and highlighted today as well, a scarring effect on young people that lasts into their adulthood too, and again, particularly for the most disadvantaged. But we know that that doesn't have to be the case. At the moment, at the age of 16, the disadvantage gap is just over 18 months on average. And we know that that gap grows as young people enter into post-16. Now, today is day one of the new Secretary of State's job. So he has a real opportunity, I think, to break out of those patterns that we see year on year and to break the cycle of inequality. So what I would be asking the new Secretary of State to do, taking into account everything we've seen today, is firstly to start early. We know that about 40% of the gap by age 16 is already evident by the age of 5. We know that if you invest in the early years, it has long-term impacts, not only on educational attainment, but labour market earnings, incarceration rates, and higher education completion as well. So we need to invest in higher quality early education and access for the most disadvantaged. Secondly, and I'm sure David will be pleased to hear this, we need a better deal for post-16 pupils, particularly for those on vocational and technical pathways. As Andreas alluded to, the government in England invests about 23% less on technical education than it does on academic pathways. And that's in complete opposite to the OECD average trend, where on average OECD countries spend about 16% more on technical education than academic. And the third and final point is that the new Secretary of State needs to address the root causes of poverty, acknowledging that the education system alone cannot address and tackle inequality. So he needs to work closely with his counterparts in welfare, in housing, and in health on a cross-government, realistic and ambitious child poverty strategy. So that's everything from me. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Natalie. I'll pass over to you, Lucy, if that's okay.
Thanks very much. And again, thanks to Andrea. I mean, you've given us a rich seam of data to be mined, and we can only start to sort of pick out some of the early nuggets from this. I think, as Natalie, we're all seeing this in the context of a new minister at the department and the urgent sense of the need for investment in the sector if we are to recover from the pandemic. So I think your figures underline the vital importance of investing in education, and there's some dispute possibly with the Treasury, I'm not sure, who tend to see it more in terms of expenditure rather than investment. One of the points I just want to emphasize is the extent to which money spent on education is an investment, not just directly in our children, but in the economy, and has direct payback that we need to look at. I was interested in your figures because I think the IFS had slightly different figures, that the Institute for Fiscal Studies suggested recently that real-term spending in the 10 years up to 2020, I think, had fallen in real terms by 10%, and most importantly, they'd fallen by 14% for the most disadvantaged schools. Now, that may be just a function of different timelines, but I think both figures suggest that we are not competing at sort of the same level as our peers internationally. So I want to make the case, I hope that the new minister will look again at the question of catch-up, since I think the department, in terms of the comprehensive spending review, doesn't look as though it's making that push for catch-up funding as opposed to other things. And the point I particularly want to pick up from your figures, I think, is the early years. And one of the things is, if you care about inequality, you need to start early. We are failing, and I think sort of successive policy initiatives have failed, partly because they've been concerned with child care rather than child education. But the figure that I picked out in the report was that, saying that 38% of nursery, of sort of pre-primary spend was private as opposed to a 17% OECD average, and that critically, in terms of that childcare piece, the net costs amount to virtually 50% of average women's earnings. So saying on both terms, both as childcare proposition and in terms of providing quality education, particularly for the most disadvantaged. I think all of us, nobody supposes that all money gets spent well, but it needs to be targeted. So I think the case for targeted spend, and probably we'd end up, I suspect David is going to end up the other half of Natalie's piece, early years and the post-16 particularly need some more spend. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. I'll pass it over to you then, David. Thank you.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Natalie and Lucy. That's a really good setup, isn't it? I've got 4 issues. The first one is lost learning. I mean, I think we need to understand more about the impact of it. The early intelligence we're getting from colleges that do an initial assessment with learners in this period, the first few weeks, is that the impact has been very different on different groups of learners. So lower level learners have been impacted much more in terms of lost learning, and we're really worried about it. We think we'll have analysis on that compares the cohort this year with 2018-2019 hopefully by Tory Party conference, because that'll be useful for some campaigning. So we need some urgent spend, as Lucy and Natalie said, on catch up, and I'm not convinced that the government get that. We really must make sure Nadine Zahawi gets it. But we also need a long-term strategy, because it won't be solved in the short term. And I don't think we've got a strategy on the inequalities that exist throughout education. So that's number one. Number 2 is colleges, schools, universities did a great job on moving online. You know, they moved mountains in really rapid time. But what I think the pandemic exposed was just a complete lack of investment in technical digital infrastructure, lack of investment in CPD for teachers. I think lots of people were floundering. There was enormous digital poverty for learners, which won't go away. I mean, the number of learners who were learning on a phone because at home they didn't have Wi-Fi, they didn't have a laptop. It's just shocking, really. And again, that won't go away. And we need to invest in that in terms of schools and colleges' ability, but also digital poverty for learners themselves. And we need to learn what worked, because we saw, I think, lots of higher achieving learners doing really well in the pandemic. We found kind of counterintuitively some disadvantaged learners being more engaged through digital because of the flexibility. We need to really learn about that and really embed the learning into the system, because actually blended is part of the future. And we can't just go back to the old days, because I think we'd lose something if we did that. Third is around exams and assessments. I think the other big exposure of the pandemic was a high-stakes endpoint assessment system just isn't the best way to go. It's not fair, despite what Nick Gibb said, although I suppose he's history now. Nick Gibb kept telling me it's the fairest form of assessment. It's a good form of assessment, doing exams in a written way, but it's not enough. And what we must do is, again, learn some lessons from that and think about the ongoing assessment that complements the endpoint to make sure that that high stakes kind of reduces, and that we start to learn a bit from the vocational, where we didn't see the grade inflation because the system is much more a blended approach to assessment. So really important lessons from that. And then the fourth, I think, goes to your point, Andreas, at the end about older learners. We do invest a lot in tertiary education in this country, but so much of it is for 18 to 23-year-olds in that sort of 3-year, 4-year degree. And so little of it is in adults in the workplace. And we've got nothing at the moment that addresses that. The skills bill, the white paper, talk a good game about it, but we've halved the investment in adults over the last decade. Halved the investment. We used to have about 3.2 million adults learning every year. It's about 1.3 million now. I mean, it's a shocking, shocking indictment of the last decade. And as well as government investment in that, we must get employers to invest more. If you look at the shortages, HGV drivers, nurses, logistics, digital, all over the economy, there are skills shortages. The government isn't the only one responsible for that. Employers need to invest more. And Andreas, I'd love to see more focus on employer investment in skills as well, compared across the nations. I know you've got that data. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, David. A lot of symmetry and agreement across our panel, which is great to see. But before I go out to questions from the audience or anyone online, Andreas, is there anything you want to come back to, particularly from what our panelists have said?
Yeah, there's been actually a lot of research on the loss of opportunity during pandemic, and I think the evidence for many countries is simply that it has hit bright kids from poor families most. Basically, they've lost out by a large margin. And generally, it is also hit younger children more than older children. I think there's some really good studies on this, I think. At the same time, I think we should also look at a little bit in a positive way that students probably have also learned things that they would not have learned in normal times, to study on your own, to set your own learning goals, to monitor your learning progress, to acquire, more dynamic learning strategies. And I think we should try to capture those as well and try to see, that we don't go back, as they say, build back better, but build forward differently. Now, really, I think that's so important. Your question on the online infrastructure, I think, is very relevant. I mean, this basically crisis has caught most education systems cold. Not all of them. If you look at countries like Estonia, they were really well prepared because they were sort of digital natives on this. But, I want to, just make one point here. It's not so much an issue of infrastructure. It's a lot more about, 47% of British 15-year-olds can actually navigate the internet effectively. The majority of 15-year-old students, even if you give them the best possible online environment, have trouble actually navigating it. And I think distinguishing fact from opinion, all those kinds of things. So I think that's a critical shortage. Our education systems have, really been focused on paper. We teach even science like religion. They make you believe certain things rather than to question things. And that's really what the digital age requires. I think that's one of the things. Student kind of competencies. And the teacher skills as well. I think, most of the technology during the pandemic has been used to conserve existing practice. You do Zoom lessons. Very little has been used to really transform learning. And I think that's where the future really needs to be. And hopefully this is not forgotten after the pandemic. My biggest fear is really that people say, we're going back to basics. Your point on adult learning, I didn't actually show the numbers, but we have numbers. In the pandemic, actually, the adult learning has declined steeper than the institutional learning, simply because, employment investment has gone down, but also individual participation. It became much more difficult. Same on skill-based learning, vocational education and training, of course. Social distancing made that a lot harder than learning in a classroom. So I think we don't pay much attention to this. And on the question of who should pay for adult learning, I do agree that employers should pick up part of the cost, but why not higher education? I somehow think for skill-based learning, for vocational education, we always say this is something employers should do because it's about work skills. We don't make that argument for higher education. I do think we should take a more broader look across all layers of education. Who should pay for what, when, and how do you share the cost between individuals, employers, and taxpayers? But I think that same question should be raised for, I think you have a system here in the UK that is heavily based to the higher education sector. There's lots of subsidies in there. And that actually, pays very little attention to funding alternative routes. So I think that's the point I want to make there. But I do agree, clearly employers are part of the beneficiaries. They should, contribute to this. And actually, in many countries, my own country, Germany, employers pay a big chunk of the cost even of high school, by providing lots of learning opportunities in workplaces. There are lots of ways how you can incentivize employers to do that. But again, I think that needs to be looked at quite broadly. It's not about, asking employers to just pay for continuing education.
Great, thank you very much, Andreas. We'll take some questions now, and if you could just say who you are and which panel member you'd like to address the question to, that would be great. So one down here, please. Oh, just there, Jane, thanks.
Hi, thanks very much, James. I'm Kate Green, Labour's Shadow Education Secretary. Andreas, I think I just heard you say that you felt that bright children from the poorest families had suffered the most in the pandemic in terms of learning loss and impact. I'm surprised at that, I must say. I do think low-income families, children in low-income families have suffered the most, but I'm trying to square that with what I know Natalie has shown me before, which is the very, very damaging effect of persistent poverty on the attainment gap. And I'm surprised that it's not all children in low-income families, and especially the less gifted children that have not suffered the greatest impact. And I wonder if you could, perhaps you, Natalie, other panel members could comment on why you think it's the bright children in low-income families that have suffered most.
Yeah, I was referring to studies from Italy and the Netherlands, where they have, and France actually, which have tracked, they just look at earlier test data and subsequent test data, and that's what they found, basically. Quite consistently, it was the kind of high-performing students from disadvantaged families where they saw the steepest decline in learning outcomes.
Natalie, do you want to pick it up from on your research?
Yeah, I mean, our research doesn't look specifically at high-performing, low-income children. We do know that lower-income children have fared worse under the pandemic, so we know that for the average child, they've fallen behind between 2 to 3 months, as they were at the end of the spring term of 2021. And we know that disadvantaged children have fallen further behind. We know that children in parts of the northeast and Yorkshire and the Humber have fallen even further behind. But we don't as yet identify bright but poor.
And James, if I can just add, I'd say that at ARC, I think we've got very mixed data. So we did summer assessments, and we're very conscious that the data there is incomplete. But what we've seen, and I think it's mirrored in other schools, is an incredibly patchy thing, that it's depended very much both on the sort of geographic specifics of how much schooling was lost, and that has focused quite often in areas of high disadvantage. But within that, it's from family to family, and you're seeing a new class of the disadvantaged, which is to do with family circumstances, people whose families have been, thrown into poverty by what's happened in the pandemic. So I would certainly say in our experience, it's much broader and probably sort of the least advantaged, those who were furthest behind to start with, who've suffered most. So slightly different from what you're seeing in Italy.
And David, from the college's perspective, is that what you're saying?
No, that's exactly right. I mean, I think what we're looking at particularly is those students who got a grade 3 or 4 in their English or Maths GCSE, and that group looks to have suffered most, actually. So, as I say, we'll get the evidence of it fully in the next couple of weeks.
Great, thank you. Another question, Anne-Marie at the side there.
Hi, I'm Anne-Marie. I'm CEO of the Brilliant Club and the independent chair of the Bradford Opportunity Area. Bradford's a city that's basically been in permanent lockdown. In fact, one of our primary schools had 700 bubble closures. I noted Andreas's slide that showed investment into geographies in some countries. Do we think there's a case to be made, particularly some of the comments we just heard there, around investing into regions that have suffered and actually historically have never been at the levels that we've seen in other places? So what do we think about geography, place-based investment as we emerge from COVID?
Great, thanks, Anne-Marie. Andreas, do you want to kick us off on that one?
Well, one of the last slides I showed is that that's exactly what we're seeing in many countries now, that it's social background, geography, social background of schools and students, geography, that they all factor into the school funding formulas. And I do think that's really the resources. Countries like Sweden, Finland, Denmark have a long history with those kinds of systems. Australia has done it perhaps in the most systematic ways by really defining those kinds of funding formulas, but I do think that is very, very important for the future to really think about where does the challenge lie and how can we align resources with them at the individual level, at the institutional level, and then, at the system level.
Thank you. Natalie, I know EPI's done a lot of work on regional inequalities and funding.
And I was really interested that today's report highlighted the UK as standing out in terms of those regional inequalities, which again reflects everything we know already. We know that young people living in certain areas, parts of the north coastal communities, have fallen further behind during the pandemic. We know that the gaps for those young people were already larger than the average. And we know that government funding isn't working to level up opportunity across the country. So the work that we've done in EPI, looking at the impact of the new national funding formula, finds that the beneficiaries of the extra money that has gone into education has been non-disadvantaged pupils, non-EAL pupils, non-SEND pupils. So I think one of the things that the government ought to be looking at is how it can it should be reviewing the national funding formula and looking at more granular factors, including neighbourhood characteristics, the kind of poverty and the kind of demographics at a neighbourhood level, and target funding that way.
Lucy, yeah?
Yeah, and I agree. I think we've suggested a group of people in the education sector put together a sort of proposal on catch-up funding specifically designed to address this and other issues. We thought that using persistent disadvantage was probably a quick and easy measure. I mean, we need to look sort of down at the granular level, but in terms of doing a sort of funding movement, if you sort of match persistent disadvantages, so students who've been on pupil premium for sort of 80% of their sort of school career, that pretty much mirrors, I think, in a sense, the COVID map. London might get a little bit of a fillip, which it doesn't deserve, but otherwise that would be a quick and easy way to focus, to target your funding.
I completely agree with all of that, but I'd also add a longer-term strategy around economic development. You know, there's no point just pushing more and more money into education. We've got to think about the jobs and the labour market. So, and we've got opportunities. You know, the green skills revolution could be a revolution if we invested in it, and we could do that regionally. We could do it in the places where it would have the biggest impact. I don't see any of that happening at the moment. I see more and more of the investment, sadly, always coming to London and the South East, kind of reinforcing the labour market dynamics, where more educated young people just end up drifting down to London because that's where the jobs are. So we need a long-term strategy on this that's quite holistic.
Thanks, David. And Andreas, you showed a slide in your presentation about different OECD countries' approach to distributing money by sort of equity and disadvantage. Are there any particular countries we should look out for that do it well, do it better than we do?
You know, I think the funding formulas that you have in countries like Australia are best understood because they're sort of very well articulated. In Sweden, you have the funding goes sort of in a bucket to the school, and then the school has to sort of think about it goes in equity-related criteria to the school, but then the school has a lot of responsibility to divide it up, how to actually deploy it. So that's much harder sort of to emulate because there's a lot of variability in this. But this has been, the reason why I showed the chart is that that's been a real shift over the last, 4 or 5 years across the world. In the past, money was just rolled out like this. Or even regressively, you look at the United States, per student's funding varies from $3,500 to $25,000 per student. And usually, actually, regressively, the better the area you live, the more money the school gets. That's how you spend a lot and achieve actually very little. That's the past, but now we see a really general trend towards, looking at the context of the student and the school and then allocating resources by this. I also think a per-student component is really important. It is, even in a wealthy area, important for schools to have incentives to attract to care for students where more resources need to be invested. So I think the student component and the school component, and they do play a role. I think this is something that I think is a very encouraging development, that there is more money going into schools, but it's also going into schools in a more differentiated way now.
Great. Thanks, Andreas. We've got time for a couple more questions, so down the front here. James.
Hi, Reza Schwitz here from Public First. Listening to you all talking about, regional inequality, early years, the adult education budget, special educational needs. I mean, the elephant in the room for me is local government. And I think we all know what's happened to local authority funding over the last 10 plus years. I'm really interested in the panel's views in terms of closing the gap in terms of disadvantage, where local authorities have so much responsibility still. What's their role going forward, and what should the advice be to the new Education Secretary?
Great, thank you very much. Andreas, again, do you mind starting as always us off on the question?
Yeah, this is something where education systems vary a lot, how you distribute the money, centrally, regionally, locally, school-based. It's very hard to derive any meaningful lessons from across countries. We have some highly centralized systems, we have some very localized systems, and I don't have any kind of lessons to derive from that.
David?
Yeah, I think the issue is about accountability to place, actually. So we have a very weak system of accountability for schools, colleges, universities to the place they operate in. And I think that we suffer because of that. So you can be a very, very successful school, college, university, not actually doing much for the place you operate in, because you can suck in learners and students from elsewhere, you can cream off the ones you want to work with. You can ignore the local social issues because there's nobody on your back, you know, and the accountability framework doesn't measure that, you know. So we've got to change that. Local government might be part of that, you know, elected mayors might be part of that. You know, in the skills bill, they're talking about these local skills improvement partnerships. That might be part of it, but it's a mess, you know, and we've then got the government saying we want more elected mayors in a patchwork quilt way. What happens if you haven't got an elected mayor and that's the way we go with it? So I think there's a fundamental question of devolution and accountability for the whole of the education system to place and for the communities in places that are not getting served properly.
Thanks, David. Lucy?
Yeah, I'm not sure we're going to come up collectively with anything very helpful. This is the eternal middle tier problem about, you know, how you manage that accountability. And I don't think we've got a satisfactory answer. David's right, we've got a kind of patchwork at the moment, and we're betwixt and between in a way that doesn't particularly serve anyone. I would love to see that kind of real local accountability and local strategic thinking about things. I don't have the answer at the moment to sort of how you would effectively do that in any likely universe.
Thanks, Lucy. Natalie?
Yeah, we got into this a bit earlier in the week. So I think there were two things. The first is we absolutely do need to address the issue of not having a middle tier, and local authority school services have been completely depleted. But the second thing is that funding for wider children's services, which would ordinarily go through local authorities, has suffered massive cuts over the decade from 2010 to 2020, cuts of around 20% per child in real terms. And that's the funding that was used to pay for early intervention, for youth services, for elements of safeguarding. So it's no wonder then that local authorities are quite hamstrung in what they can do for young people, and then the knock-on effect as we see that burden falling to schools in many cases.
Thanks, Natalie. And Andreas, you wanted to come
back?
Yeah,
if I may just add one comment. I think it's often also about the nature of the local environment. Like, you can take, again, the United States as a country where actually local control is very strong. Actually, most decisions in the school systems are made by school districts, not even by the state. But actually, if you look at this through the lens of a school, it's a highly centralized school system. Schools actually have very few degrees of freedom. They're all told everything by the kind of school district. And the school districts often don't have the competence and the capacity to make wise decisions. So I think it's actually an example where, you know, it's a matter of, you know, what capacity you have at the community level. I would, you know, contrast this with Finland, where actually also most decisions are made by the local level. But, you know, if you are a school leader in Finland, you'll spend two-thirds of your time running your school, and one-third of your time you work in the local community. So the local community is not a place of, you know, bureaucrats. It's a place where actually schools collaborate to frame, you know, good school practice. So that's a very, very different structure. My country, Germany, is another example where, you know, they have divided it up by functionally. You know, the central government pays very little, the regional government pay the teacher salaries, and the local governments have to pay for the infrastructure. It just doesn't work. If you're in a poor community, infrastructure will be poor. You can have very well paid teachers. So it's really a matter of, you know, what is the functional distribution of tasks, and then, you know, how do you build the capacity at the local level to do something meaningful. I think there are unfortunately many examples where that is not very effective.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one final question, because I know Andreas needs to run off to the Department for Education. So, Sean here. We'll have two more. Sean here and one more.
Thanks. On the regional inequalities, you had a slide in a report that you didn't show about graduates, and it showed that the UK was very unusual in how we spread out graduates within the economy. And they had a great concentration in London, I think one of the highest in the world possibly of graduates, certainly in Europe, and very low distribution in places like the northeast and northwest. Could you say something about that and what that does? Why is that so unusual to hear? And what are the consequences for the economy, countries, social mobility, and how we are as a country?
You know, I think it's a chicken and egg issue, really. If you have, you know, the UK is an example where, you know, demand is very uneven, skill demand. You know, if you live in London, there's every incentive for everyone to go to university because you're going to get a great job. The labor market is very good in extracting value from the skills of people, so you have a high concentration of demand and a high concentration of supply. If you live in a kind of remote environment, why would you study hard when there is no, credible, no high-skilled employer around you? There's a kind of what we call, you have coexisting high skills equilibria and with low skills equilibria. And I think that's a very kind of dangerous environment because there's no natural way for that to change. It really requires active policies to encourage the transition from a low skills equilibrium to a high skills equilibrium. There are some very, very good examples for this. We have, data from Portugal. We have data from the north of Italy, where people used to produce shoes, and now it's, high-tech fashion. And that was actually quite a deliberate strategy to incentivize, the demand for better skills, and then gradually people pick up better skills and use them. But I think that's a really, really tough challenge. These low skills equilibria are very persistent because they set, wrong incentives for learners, and they particularly. Yeah, I think it will hinder social mobility. It means there's a lot of unused talent. A lot of people who have actually great potential will not invest in their education because they don't see the sense, the purpose out of it. I think there's a lot of, underutilization of talent in a low skills kind of equilibrium.
Great, thank you. I'm sorry, there's a couple more questions, but we have run out of time, but I think the panelists will be around afterwards, so there'll be a chance to ask us. But I know Andreas needs to go off. But I'd just like to, before we wrap up, just to thank the panel very much for their contributions. So if we could give them a round of applause. And we'll be watching carefully whether build forward differently becomes the mantra of the new cabinet. So thank you for that. So I'll pass over to Peter to wrap us up. Thank you.
2 minutes. You don't have to run I think we've all found out that Andres doesn't have any opinions, just facts, okay? Listen, I want to thank all our participants, especially, of course, Andreas. Let's give him another round of applause. Listen, thank you all for coming. I think we can give all the participants a round of applause as well. I don't know about you guys, but I'm ready for a cup of coffee. I'm told they've got fresh coffee next door, not from earlier today. So anyway, thanks for coming.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Resend the letter.
Really have to